You know that moment when you scroll through a sea of gaming desktops, see a machine that looks like it could crush the latest releases, add it to your cart, and then after it arrives realize it's more of a nice to look at than a nice to play on? I've been there, and I've talked to a handful of folks who felt the same disappointment. The hype in the thumbnail doesn't always match the noise level in the living room, or the upgrade path is suddenly a maze. That's why I'm breaking down the MSI Aegis RS Tower before you spend a chunk of cash, so you can sidestep the usual buyer's remorse. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the Aegis RS isn't a custom-built beast that you have to assemble piece by piece. It arrives pre-wired, with an Intel Core i7-12700KF and an RTX 3070 Ti already bolted in, which means you can power it on and jump straight into a 1440p, 144Hz session without fiddling with BIOS settings. That's a huge time saver for anyone who wants the performance of a high-end build but hates the learning curve of a DIY rig. The liquid cooling loop that comes stock does a decent job keeping the i7's 12 cores under control, so you won't be shouting at a screaming fan when you're mid-match or streaming a highlight reel. Now, the thing that really sets this model apart in the current market is the DDR5 memory support. It ships with 16GB of 4800 MHz DDR5 and a dual-channel configuration, which feels noticeably snappier in loading screens compared to older DDR4 kits. If you're the type who switches between a demanding AAA title, a web browser full of tabs, and maybe a Discord voice chat, those extra gigahertz give you a small but real edge. The motherboard also leaves room for up to 128GB, so the upgrade path is there if you ever decide you need more headroom for heavy multitasking or future games that eat RAM like candy. Storage is another practical consideration. A 1TB NVMe SSD is fast enough to keep load times in the sub-3 range for most modern games, and the drive's placement on the motherboard means you get the best possible bandwidth. That said, if you're the kind of player who hoards a large library of indie titles, mods, and a handful of 4K video projects, you'll probably hit that 1TB ceiling sooner rather than later. Adding a second SSD is possible, but you'll need to buy a compatible drive and a mounting bracket. Nothing impossible, just an extra step that a truly plug-and-play buyer might not expect. Connectivity in the Aegis RS is pretty solid for a pre-built. Wi-Fi 6E handles the high-speed routers most gamers have now, and the inclusion of a USB-C port on the front panel makes it easy to plug in a fast external SSD or a modern controller without hunting for a cable. The rear I/O still has the classic trio of USB-A ports, a DisplayPort, and an HDMI 2.1 output, which means you can run a dual monitor setup or hook up a 4K TV without a dongle. The Verity label isn't just a marketing tagline. The RTX 3070 Ti has enough horsepower to push most head-mounted displays at 90Hz with room to spare, and the liquid cooler helps keep the GPU temperature down during those intensive VR sessions. So who should actually consider buying this box? If you're a gamer who wants to hit high settings at 1440p now and doesn't mind paying a premium for a system that's already assembled, the Aegis RS checks a lot of boxes. It's also a good fit for streamers who need a CPU that can handle both gaming and encoding on the same chip. Thanks to the i7's 12 cores, you can run OBS while keeping your frame rate stable. The built-in Wi-Fi 6E and USB-C also appeal to people who prefer a tidy desk and don't want to manage a tangle of external adapters. On the flip side, if you're looking for a strict budget solution, you'll find the price tag a bit steep compared to building a similar spec on your own. The 16GB of RAM, while fast, might feel limiting after a year or two when newer titles start recommending 32GB for smooth performance, especially if you also plan to stream. And if you're the type who likes to swap out graphics cards every few months to stay on the bleeding edge, the liquid cooling loop could make those swaps more cumbersome than a standard air-cooled chassis. In short, it's a great ready-to-go machine for people who want performance now, but not the best pick for hardcore upgraders or ultra-tight budgets. Let's talk about the day-to-day experience. I set the Aegis RS up on a modest desk beside a 27-inch 1440p monitor, plugged in the power, hooked up the Ethernet cable for the most stable connection, and fired up Cyberpunk 2077 at ultra settings. The game loaded within seconds, stayed above 70 frames per second, and the fans were barely audible, a testament to the liquid cooling working as advertised. Switching over to a VR title like Half-Life, Alyx, I didn't notice any stutter or thermal.